Most people don't realize the moment they lost control. It didn't happen in some dramatic collapse, no loud crash, no clear turning point you could point to and say, that's where it all went wrong. It happened quietly, almost politely, the way a stranger slips into the empty seat across from you at a coffee shop, and before you notice, starts rearranging everything on your table. You think you're still in charge. You think you're choosing what to pay attention to. But if you're honest, really honest, you'd see something uncomfortable. Your attention doesn't belong to you anymore. You wake up, and before your feet touch the floor, your hand reaches out, almost automatically, like muscle memory trained over years. Not to stretch, not to breathe, but to grab a glowing piece of glass that decides what you'll feel for the next hour. And that's the part nobody likes to admit, because it sounds weak. It sounds like something that happens to other people, not to someone who pays their bills, shows up to work, keeps things together on the outside. But watch closely, not at what people say, but at what they do in the quiet moments. The elevator ride, the red light at an empty intersection, the 2-minute wait in line for coffee. And you'll see it, the reflex, the twitch, the need to fill every gap with something fast, something easy, something that doesn't ask anything in return. It's strange when you think about it, because not that long ago, boredom used to mean something. It used to be the space where ideas showed up uninvited, where you'd sit on a worn-out couch staring at the ceiling, letting your mind wander into places you didn't plan. Now boredom feels like a problem that needs fixing, like a leak you patch immediately before it spreads. And the tools we use to patch it, they're everywhere, cheap, endless, always within reach. Scroll a little, watch a clip, check a notification. Just one more, and suddenly an hour is gone, and you can't even remember what you were looking at. Not because you're careless, but because none of it asked you to remember. It just needed you to stay. And that's the deal, whether people realize it or not. You trade your attention for small hits of something that feels like satisfaction, but doesn't last long enough to matter. It's like eating candy when you're hungry. It keeps your mouth busy, but it doesn't feed you. And over time, something inside you starts to change, slowly enough that you don't notice day by day, but deep enough that it reshapes how you live. Things that used to require effort, reading, thinking, building something from scratch, start to feel heavier, like trying to run through water. Not impossible, just harder than they should be. Meanwhile, the easy stuff gets easier. Your brain learns the shortcut, learns that it can get a reward without doing the work, and once it learns that, it doesn't forget. That's when the real shift happens. Not when you can't focus at all, but when you stop trying to. When 10 minutes of effort feels like too much, but 2 hours of scrolling feels normal. When silence makes you uncomfortable, not because something is wrong, but because you've trained yourself to avoid it. And here's the part that stings a little. It's not your fault in the way you think, but it is your responsibility. Because the world you're living in now, it's designed this way. Every notification, every autoplay video, every endless feed is built to keep you there, to make leaving feel like missing out on something important, even when there's nothing important happening. It's a system that rewards you for staying distracted and punishes you, quietly, for trying to focus. And the punishment isn't loud. It doesn't show up as failure right away. It shows up as something softer, more subtle. You sit down to do something that matters, and your mind drifts after a few minutes. You try to read, and your eyes move, but nothing sticks. You start something, then stop, then start again, like an engine that won't fully turn over. You tell yourself you'll get serious tomorrow, that you just need the right mood, the right moment, the right push. But tomorrow comes, and the pattern repeats. Not because you're incapable, but because you've been conditioned to expect reward before effort, not after. And once that expectation sets in, everything else feels off. Real work feels slow. Real progress feels invisible. Real satisfaction takes too long. So you go back to what's immediate, what's easy, what's already wired into your habits. It's not dramatic, it's just consistent. Day after day, small choices that don't seem like much on their own, but add up to something bigger. A life where you're always busy, but rarely moving forward. A mind that's always stimulated, but rarely clear. And if you sit with that long enough, really sit with it, you start to see the question underneath all of it, the one most people avoid because it doesn't have an easy answer. if your attention is constantly pulled in 100 directions, if your focus is always fragmented, if your time is spent reacting instead of choosing, then whose life are you actually living? Because it doesn't feel like yours anymore, does it? It feels borrowed. It feels directed. It feels like you're following something instead of leading. And that's the hook, the part that catches you if you're paying attention. Not the idea that you're lazy or broken, but the possibility that you've been trained, slowly and effectively, to settle for less without even realizing it. And once you see that, really see it, you can't unsee it. Every scroll starts to feel a little different. Every notification sounds a little louder. Every moment you reach for your phone without thinking becomes a small signal, a reminder that something deeper is going on. Not on the surface, not in what you're watching or reading, but underneath, in the way your brain has learned to operate. And the uncomfortable truth is, most people will notice this and then do nothing. Not because they don't care, but because change feels harder than staying the same. Because the system is comfortable, familiar, easy to slip back into. But every once in a while, someone pauses just long enough to ask a different question. Not, what should I watch next? Or, what am I missing? But something quieter, sharper. What is this doing to me? And that question, it doesn't shout, it doesn't demand attention. It just sits there, waiting, like a cup of coffee gone cold on a table you've been ignoring, until you finally pick it up and realize it tastes different than you expected. Daniel wasn't the kind of guy people worried about. If you saw him from the outside, you'd probably think he had things handled well enough. He showed up to work on time, nodded through meetings, paid his rent before the late fee hit, and remembered birthdays just often enough to not look careless. The kind of man who blends into the background of a crowded city street. Not invisible, just unremarkable. But if you sat across from him long enough, really watched, the way you watch someone when the conversation fades and the silence starts to say more than the words, you'd notice something was off. Not broken, not dramatic, just slightly out of sync, like a clock that's always a few minutes behind, no matter how many times you reset it. His mornings were the first place it showed up. The alarm would go off at 6:30, same tone every day, a soft chime that used to feel calm, but now just felt like an obligation. His hand would move before his eyes even fully opened, sliding across the nightstand until it found his phone. Not to turn the alarm off, he did that almost absent-mindedly, but to check what happened while he was asleep. Notifications stacked like unopened letters, emails from work that could have waited, messages that didn't really say anything, a few short videos recommended by something that knew him better than he liked to admit. He'd tell himself it was just a minute, just enough to wake up his brain. But minutes have a way of stretching when nothing is asking you to stop. By the time he sat up, the room already felt different, like his mind had been pulled through a dozen places before his body even caught up. Coffee came next. Always coffee. He'd stand in his small kitchen, one hand holding the mug, the other still scrolling, thumb moving in that slow, practiced rhythm. The coffee would cool faster than he drank it. Sometimes he'd forget it entirely, leaving it on the counter like a small reminder of something he meant to finish but didn't. And that was the pattern, not just with coffee but with everything. Half-finished thoughts, half-started tasks, a constant feeling of being in motion without really going anywhere. Work didn't help. He sat at a desk under fluorescent lights that made everything look a little more tired than it actually was. His job wasn't hard in the way people talk about hard jobs. No heavy lifting, no long hours in the sun. Just screens, numbers, emails, the quiet pressure of deadlines that never felt urgent until they were already too close. He'd open a document, stare at it for a few seconds, then his hand would drift back to his phone without him fully deciding to do it. A quick check, just a break. But breaks stopped feeling like pauses and started feeling like default settings. 10 minutes of work, 20 minutes gone somewhere else. And the strange part was, he knew it. He wasn't unaware. He'd catch himself mid-scroll sometimes, a small flicker of clarity cutting through the noise, thinking, what am I even doing? But the moment passed as quickly as it came, replaced by the next piece of content, the next distraction, the next easy hit of something that felt like relief, but left nothing behind. Lunch breaks were the same story, just in a different setting. He'd sit alone more often than not because he didn't like people, but because it was easier. Easier to eat quickly, easier to scroll, easier to avoid the kind of conversations that require you to be present. Around him, the city moved at its usual pace. cars stopping and starting at intersections, people rushing with takeout bags, someone arguing on the phone just loud enough for everyone to hear. Life happening in real time, but Daniel was always slightly removed from it, like he was watching through a pane of glass. Evenings didn't offer much of a reset. He'd get home, tired in that specific way that doesn't come from physical effort, but from mental clutter. The kind of tired that makes you want to sit down and do nothing, but somehow ends up turning into hours of doing something that doesn't matter. He'd drop his keys on the same spot by the door, kick off his shoes, and tell himself he'd relax for a bit before doing something productive. Maybe cook a proper meal, maybe read, maybe finally start that course he signed up for weeks ago. But the couch had a gravity to it, and the phone made it worse. One video turned into 5 turned into 50. The room would get darker without him noticing, the only light coming from the screen reflecting off his face. Time slipped in a way that felt almost unfair, like it was moving faster for him than for everyone else. And when he finally looked up, it was late. Too late to start anything meaningful. Too late to do anything except promise himself he'd do better tomorrow. That promise became a quiet habit, not dramatic, not even spoken out loud most of the time. Just a thought that showed up at the end of the day, sat with him for a moment, then disappeared by morning. Weekends were supposed to be different, but they weren't. He'd wake up without an alarm, which felt good for about 5 minutes, until the same pattern kicked in. Phone, scroll, coffee, more scrolling. The hours stretched out in front of him, full of potential, but somehow they always ended the same way, used up, but not used well. He'd occasionally try to break the cycle, delete an app, turn off notifications, make a small rule for himself. But the changes never lasted long, not because he didn't want them to, but because the pull was constant, subtle, built into the spaces between things. It wasn't just about willpower, it was about environment, habit, expectation, all working together in ways he didn't fully understand. Then came the moment that shifted something. Not a big event, nothing you'd put in a movie, just a Tuesday night. He was sitting on the couch, phone in hand, thumb moving the way it always did, when he realized he didn't remember what he'd been watching for the past 20 minutes. Not a single detail. It all blurred together into something forgettable, something that filled time but didn't leave a mark. He paused, thumb hovering over the screen, and for a second, everything felt still. The room, the noise, even his own thoughts. And in that small gap, something honest slipped through. A simple question, but it landed heavier than he expected. If this is how I spend my time, what am I actually building? He didn't answer it right away. Maybe he couldn't. But the question stayed. It followed him into the kitchen as he finally reheated his untouched dinner. It sat with him while he ate, without the usual distraction. It lingered when he went to bed, the phone still within reach, but not as appealing as it used to be. The next morning, when the alarm went off and his hand reached out like it always did, he hesitated. Just for a second. Not enough to feel dramatic, but enough to notice. And that's where it started. Not with a burst of motivation, not with a perfectly planned system, but with a pause. A small interruption in a pattern that had been running for years. He didn't make a big speech to himself, didn't announce a life change. He just made a quiet decision that felt almost too simple to matter. He would stop feeding his brain things that gave him nothing back, at least for a while. 14 days, no scrolling in bed, no random videos during work, no phone in hand every time silence showed up. It sounded easy when he thought about it, almost obvious. But as soon as he started, he realized how deep the habit went. The first day felt off in a way he couldn't fully explain. Like walking into a room where the furniture had been rearranged just enough to throw you off. His hands didn't know what to do with themselves. His mind kept reaching for something that wasn't there. He'd catch himself standing in the kitchen, halfway through making coffee, suddenly aware that he usually filled that exact moment with a quick scroll. Now it was just empty. And that emptiness felt louder than any notification. At work, the gaps became more noticeable. The moments between tasks stretched out, and without the usual escape, he had to sit with them. Sometimes he'd stare at the screen, not because he didn't know what to do, but because he wasn't used to doing it without a break every few minutes. It was uncomfortable, not painful, just unfamiliar, like using a muscle that had been ignored for too long. By the third day, the urge hit harder, not constant but sharp when it showed up. He'd reach for his phone without thinking, then stop halfway, aware of the movement like catching himself in a mirror. It felt strange to interrupt something so automatic, but each time he did, the pause got a little easier to hold on to. Evenings were the toughest. The couch still pulled him in. The routine still whispered in the background, telling him to relax the way he always had. But without the usual distractions, he started noticing things he hadn't paid attention to before. The quiet of the room, the sound of traffic outside, the way his thoughts moved when they weren't being constantly redirected. It wasn't peaceful, not at first. It was messy, uneven, sometimes frustrating. But it was real in a way his usual routine wasn't. And somewhere in that discomfort, something began to shift. Not a full transformation, not yet. Just a slight change in how he experienced his own time. Like he was starting to feel it again, instead of just letting it pass. What surprised Daniel wasn't that things got easier after a few days. That's what he expected, or at least what he hoped for. What caught him off guard was that things didn't get easier, they got clearer. And clarity, it turns out, can feel heavier than struggle. Because when everything is noisy, when your mind is constantly filled with something, videos, messages, background chatter, you can always blame the noise. You can say you're distracted, overwhelmed, tired. But when the noise starts to fade, when those easy escapes are no longer within reach, what's left standing in the middle of that silence is something harder to ignore. Yourself. Around day 5, maybe 6, Daniel started noticing that the discomfort he felt in the first few days hadn't disappeared. It had changed shape. It wasn't that restless itch anymore, that constant urge to reach for his phone like a reflex. It was quieter now, more patient. It showed up in moments he didn't expect. Sitting at his desk, staring at a task he'd been putting off for weeks, he realized the resistance he felt had nothing to do with the task itself. The task wasn't that complicated. It wasn't even that long. What made it feel heavy was something else, something he had been avoiding for a long time. The discomfort of starting, the friction of doing something that didn't give him immediate feedback. And without the option to escape into quick distractions, he had nowhere to hide from that friction. That's when the first shift happened, subtle but undeniable. He stopped asking, "How do I feel about doing this?" and started asking, "What needs to be done right now?" It sounds small, almost too simple to matter, but that change in question rewired something in the way he approached his time. Feelings became less of a deciding factor, not irrelevant, but not in control either. He began to understand something most people miss. Motivation isn't what gets you moving. It's what shows up after you've already started. And for years, he had been waiting for it to arrive first. Without the constant stream of cheap stimulation, his brain started recalibrating in ways he didn't expect. Tasks that used to feel unbearable didn't suddenly become enjoyable, but they stopped feeling impossible. There was a difference between discomfort and resistance, and he was finally starting to see it. Discomfort was part of the process. It showed up when something mattered, when effort was required. Resistance, on the other hand, was what he had been feeding every time he chose the easy option over the necessary one. And the more he fed it, the stronger it got. But now, with that pattern interrupted, resistance started losing its grip. Not all at once, not dramatically, but enough for him to notice. There was another layer to this shift, something deeper that he hadn't anticipated. His perception of time began to change. Before, days felt like they slipped through his fingers, one blending into the next without clear edges. Now, moments started to feel more defined. Not longer in the sense of dragging, but fuller, like they carried more weight. A single hour of focused work felt more substantial than an entire afternoon of distracted activity. It wasn't that time had slowed down, it was that he was finally present enough to experience it. And with that presence came something uncomfortable, but necessary. Awareness of what he had been avoiding. Old thoughts surfaced, ideas he had pushed aside, questions he didn't have answers to. Without the constant noise to drown them out, they came back, one by one, asking to be acknowledged. At first, this felt like a step backward. He wondered if he had made a mistake, if removing those distractions had opened a door he wasn't ready to walk through. But as the days passed, he started to see it differently. Those thoughts weren't new. They had always been there, waiting in the background. The only difference now was that he could no longer ignore them. And in facing them, even slowly, he began to regain something he hadn't realized he had lost. A sense of direction. Not a fully formed plan, not a clear roadmap, but a general awareness of what mattered and what didn't. It was like cleaning a cluttered room. Not everything becomes organized immediately, but once the mess is visible, You can start deciding what stays and what goes. One evening, sitting at his kitchen table with no phone in sight, Daniel noticed something that would have seemed insignificant before. He had finished everything he needed to do for the day. Not rushed, not half done, but actually completed. And instead of feeling the usual urge to fill the remaining time with something mindless, he just sat there. Not bored, not restless, just there. It wasn't a dramatic moment, no sudden realization, no surge of emotion, but there was a quiet satisfaction in it, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but stays with you longer than any quick hit of entertainment ever could. That's when the real twist revealed itself. The problem had never been that he lacked discipline. It wasn't that he was incapable of focus, or that he didn't have the ability to follow through. The problem was that his environment, and the habits built within it, had been constantly undermining those qualities. He had been trying to build discipline on top of a system designed to erode it. And once he removed the elements that were working against him, what he thought he needed to build started to show up on its own. This realization shifted how he saw everything around him. The world hadn't changed, but his awareness of it had. He started noticing how often people reached for their phones in the middle of conversations, how quickly silence made others uncomfortable, how normalized it had become to avoid any moment that didn't provide immediate stimulation. It wasn't something he judged harshly. After all, he had been the same way not long ago, but he couldn't unsee it anymore. It was like stepping outside of a current you didn't realize you were being carried by, suddenly aware of the direction it had been pulling you all along. And with that awareness came a choice. Not a one-time decision, but a continuous one. Every moment presented an opportunity to either return to old patterns or reinforce the new ones. It wasn't always easy. There were days when the pull of old habits felt stronger, when the idea of slipping back into that effortless consumption seemed tempting. But the difference now was that he saw it for what it was. Not relaxation, not reward, but escape. And once you recognize something as escape, it loses some of its power over you. The most unexpected part of this entire process was how it affected his sense of satisfaction. Before, satisfaction was something he chased through quick, repeated hits, small bursts of pleasure that faded almost as soon as they appeared. Now, satisfaction felt different, slower, less intense in the moment, but more lasting. Finishing a task, sticking to a plan, following through on something he had committed to, these didn't give him the same immediate rush as his old habits, but they left behind something more stable, a sense of progress, of movement, of alignment between what he intended to do and what he actually did. It wasn't exciting in the way he was used to, but it was real. And real, he was starting to realize, mattered more than exciting. As the second week approached, Daniel understood something that would have sounded almost obvious before, but now carried a different weight. His brain hadn't needed less stimulation, it had needed better rules. The kind that said effort comes first, reward comes after. The kind that didn't rely on how he felt in the moment, but on what he chose consistently over time. And once those rules started to take hold, everything else began to organize itself around them. Focus wasn't something he had to force anymore. It became the default when there was nothing else competing for his attention. Discipline wasn't something he had to summon. It showed up naturally when the path of least resistance aligned with what needed to be done. And perhaps most importantly, he stopped seeing himself as someone who lacked something essential. He stopped telling himself the quiet story that he just wasn't that kind of person, the kind who could stay focused, who could build something meaningful over time. Because now he had evidence to the contrary, not from a book, not from a video, but from his own experience. And that evidence changed the way he saw his own potential. Not in a grand, exaggerated sense, but in a grounded, practical way. He knew what he was capable of, not in theory, but in practice. And that knowledge didn't make things easier, but it made them clearer. And sometimes, clarity is more valuable than ease. There's a point in this kind of change where everything slows down. Not on the outside. The world keeps moving the same way it always does. Traffic still hums past your window. People still rush with their heads down. Coffee machines still hiss in the background. But inside, something shifts into a different rhythm. Daniel didn't notice it all at once. It wasn't a clean transition, no clear line separating who he was before and who he was becoming. It showed up in fragments, small moments that didn't seem important until he started connecting them. One night, he was sitting alone at his kitchen table. No music, no phone. just a plate in front of him, and the faint sound of a neighbor's TV leaking through the wall. In the past, that kind of silence would have felt unbearable, like something was missing, like the room needed to be filled with noise just to make it livable. But now, the silence didn't press against him the same way. It sat there, steady, almost neutral, like it wasn't asking anything from him. He picked up his fork, took a bite, and for the first time in a long while, he actually tasted the food. Not in a dramatic way, not like some sudden awakening, but in a simple, grounded way that made him realize how much he had been rushing through everything without noticing it. That's the thing about constant stimulation. It doesn't just take your attention, it flattens your experience. Everything becomes background noise, even the parts that are supposed to feel real. And now, with that noise pulled back, details started to come forward again. The texture of things, the pace of his own breathing, the way his thoughts moved when they weren't being interrupted every few seconds. After dinner, he didn't reach for anything. No automatic movement toward the couch, no instinct to fill the next hour with something easy. He just stayed there for a while, elbows resting on the table, eyes drifting without a specific target. His mind wandered, not in the chaotic, scattered way it used to, but in a slower, more deliberate pattern. Thoughts connected to each other instead of colliding and disappearing. He found himself revisiting things he hadn't thought about in years. Old ideas, half-formed plans, questions that never got answered because he never gave them enough space to develop. At first, it felt strange, almost like meeting a version of himself he hadn't spent time with in a long while. There was a certain discomfort in that, not because anything was wrong, but because it was unfamiliar. Most people don't spend much time with their own thoughts anymore. They pass through them quickly, like walking through a room without turning the lights on. But when you slow down enough to actually sit there, to let those thoughts unfold at their own pace, you start to see things more clearly. Not always pleasant things, not always easy things, but honest ones. Daniel noticed patterns in the way he had been living, patterns that were easy to ignore when he was constantly distracted. The way he avoided certain tasks not because they were difficult, but because they forced him to confront uncertainty. The way he filled his time with small, meaningless activities to avoid facing bigger questions. The way he told himself stories about why he couldn't change, why things were the way they were, why tomorrow would be different, even though today looked exactly like yesterday. None of this hit him all at once. It came in pieces, like fragments of a conversation he had been avoiding for a long time. And the more he sat with it, the less he felt the need to run from it. There was something steady about facing things directly, even if they weren't comfortable. It didn't fix everything, but it removed the weight of pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. In those quiet moments, he began to understand something that doesn't get talked about enough. Most of what we call lack of discipline is actually a lack of space. Space to think, space to feel, space to process what's really going on beneath the surface. When every moment is filled with noise, there's no room for that kind of clarity to emerge. And without clarity, everything feels harder than it needs to be. Decisions become heavier, actions feel forced. You move, but you don't feel aligned with what you're doing. But when that space opens up, even a little, things start to shift. Not because you suddenly become a different person, but because you start to see your own behavior more accurately. And once you see it clearly, it's harder to ignore. One evening, he went for a walk without his phone. That alone would have felt unusual a couple of weeks ago, almost uncomfortable. Now, it felt intentional. The air was cooler than he expected, carrying that faint smell of the city winding down for the night. Food from nearby restaurants, exhaust from passing cars, something distant and hard to name that reminded him he was part of a larger rhythm. He walked without a destination, just following the sidewalks as they curved through familiar streets that somehow felt slightly different without the usual distraction in his hand. People passed by, some talking, some staring at their own screens, faces lit up in that familiar glow. He noticed it more now, the way attention had become something visible, almost physical, like a thread connecting people to their devices. And for the first time, he felt separate from it. Not better, not above it, just outside of it for a moment. He stopped at a crosswalk, waiting for the light to change. Normally, this would have been one of those small gaps he filled automatically. A quick check, a brief escape. But now, he just stood there, watching the traffic, listening to the distant hum of engines, feeling the ground under his feet. It was a simple moment, nothing remarkable on the surface, but it carried a weight he hadn't noticed before. It was complete in itself. Not something to get through, not something to avoid, just something to experience. And in that simplicity, there was a kind of quiet satisfaction that didn't depend on anything external. Back at home, the same pattern continued. Nights became less about escaping the day and more about closing it properly. He started finishing things, even small ones, washing dishes right after eating, organizing his space before going to bed, not because he forced himself to, but because it felt natural to complete what he had started. These small actions didn't seem important on their own, but together, they created a sense of order that extended beyond the physical space. His mind felt less cluttered, less fragmented. Thoughts had room to settle, instead of being constantly pushed aside by the next distraction. Sleep changed too. Without the usual flood of stimulation right before bed, his mind didn't feel as scattered when he lay down. He still thought about things, still replayed parts of the day, but it was calmer, more contained. He fell asleep faster, woke up clearer. Not every day, not perfectly, but often enough to notice the difference. And mornings became something else entirely. Without reaching for his phone right away, he had a few minutes where his mind was just his. No external input, no immediate demands, just a quiet start to the day that set the tone for everything that followed. It wasn't dramatic, but it was consistent. And consistency, he was learning, mattered more than intensity. The deeper he went into this, the more he realized that what he had been chasing before, constant stimulation, quick rewards, easy satisfaction, had been masking something simpler and more valuable. A sense of alignment. Doing what needed to be done when it needed to be done, without constantly negotiating with himself. It didn't feel like forcing discipline. It felt like removing the friction that made discipline seem necessary in the first place. There were still moments of resistance, still days when things didn't flow as easily. But those moments no longer defined his entire experience. They were just part of it, not something to escape from, but something to move through. And in moving through them, he built a kind of trust in himself that hadn't been there before. Not confidence in the loud, external sense, but a quieter form of reliability. He knew that even if he didn't feel like doing something, he could still do it. And that knowledge changed how he approached everything. Sitting there one night, in that same quiet kitchen, Daniel realized that nothing about his external life had changed in a dramatic way. Same job, same apartment, same city. But the way he experienced it had shifted completely. The noise was lower, the signals were clearer, and in that clarity, he found something that had been missing for a long time. Not excitement, not constant pleasure, but a steady, grounded sense of being present in his own life. It wasn't something he could show off or explain easily. It didn't make for a good story in the way big transformations do, but it was real, and for the first time in a long while, that was enough. At some point, without marking it on a calendar or making a big deal out of it, Daniel crossed an invisible line. Not into a new life, not into some perfected version of himself, but into a different way of relating to his own time. And the interesting thing about that kind of shift is that it doesn't announce itself. There's no clear moment where everything clicks into place and stays there forever. It's quieter than that. It shows up in the way you make small decisions when no one is watching, in the way your hand pauses before reaching for something it used to grab without thinking, in the way you choose what to do next when there's nothing forcing you in any direction. That's where the real change lives, not in grand gestures, but in the absence of old habits that used to run the show. Daniel still had the same phone, the same apps, the same access to everything that used to pull him in. The world around him hadn't slowed down or become less demanding. If anything, it kept moving at the same relentless pace, always offering something new to look at, something quick to consume, something easy to fall back into. But the difference now was in how he responded to it. The pull was still there, but it no longer felt automatic. It felt like a choice. And that small shift, from reaction to choice, changed everything in a way that's hard to explain until you experience it yourself. Because once something becomes a choice, you can question it, you can pause, you can decide whether it actually serves you or just fills space. And most of the time, if you're honest in that pause, you already know the answer. He didn't become perfect. That's not how this works. There were days when he slipped back into old patterns, moments when he caught himself scrolling longer than he intended, evenings when he chose the easy option instead of the meaningful one. But those moments didn't stretch into days or weeks the way they used to. They stayed contained because he noticed them sooner. Awareness, he realized, wasn't about eliminating mistakes. It was about shortening the distance between the moment you drift and the moment you return. And that distance, over time, makes all the difference. The most important lesson he carried forward wasn't a rule or a system. It was an understanding, a simple one, but deep enough to change how he saw everything. What you do with your attention shapes what you become. Not in a philosophical sense, not in some abstract, distant way, but in the most practical terms possible. Where your attention goes, your time follows. Where your time goes, your life builds itself, piece by piece, whether you're aware of it or not. For a long time, his attention had been scattered, pulled in different directions by things that didn't require anything from him. And the result of that was a life that felt equally scattered, busy on the surface, but lacking depth underneath. Now, with his attention more contained, more intentional, his life started to reflect that same structure. Not perfectly, not all at once, but steadily. Work became something he engaged with, not something he avoided. Even when it was difficult, it felt manageable, because he wasn't constantly interrupting himself. Projects moved forward, not in big leaps, but in consistent steps. And consistency, he learned, builds something that intensity never can. Outside of work, the changes were just as real, even if they were harder to measure. Conversations felt different when he was fully present, when he wasn't half listening while thinking about something else or reaching for his phone out of habit. Time with other people became more grounded, less fragmented. Even time alone felt less like something to escape from and more like something to use. He started picking up things he had abandoned before, reading, writing, thinking through ideas without needing immediate validation or feedback. Not because he forced himself to, but because those activities started to feel rewarding in a way they hadn't when his brain was used to constant stimulation. And that's when the deeper realization settled in, the one that doesn't come from theory but from lived experience. Your brain learns from what you repeatedly show it. If you teach it that reward comes without effort, it will resist effort. If you teach it that effort leads to reward, it will start to seek effort. Not because it becomes easier in the moment, but because the pattern becomes familiar, and familiarity reduces resistance. This wasn't about cutting out everything enjoyable or living in some strict, controlled way. That idea had crossed his mind early on, the thought that maybe he needed to eliminate all distractions permanently to maintain this sense of clarity. But over time, he realized that wasn't the goal. The goal wasn't to remove pleasure. It was to put it back in its proper place, to let it follow effort, not replace it, to enjoy things without letting them take control. So he allowed himself small rewards again. A movie at the end of the day, a short scroll through something entertaining. But now, there was a boundary around it, not imposed from the outside, but understood from within. It wasn't about strict limits, it was about awareness. Knowing when something was adding to his life, and when it was quietly taking away from it. And that awareness made it easier to stop before things went too far. The system he had built wasn't complicated. In fact, it was almost boring in its simplicity. Do the hard thing first. Finish what you start. Let boredom exist without immediately trying to fix it. Reward yourself after effort, not before. These weren't groundbreaking ideas. Most people had heard them before in one form or another. But hearing something and living it are two very different things. And once he experienced the difference firsthand, those simple principles carried more weight than any complex strategy ever could. There was also a shift in how he viewed the world around him. He no longer saw distractions as harmless or neutral. He saw them for what they were, tools designed to capture and hold attention. Not evil, not inherently bad, but not passive either. They had a direction, a purpose, and if he wasn't careful, that purpose would override his own. That didn't make him paranoid or overly cautious, but it made him intentional. He chose when to engage and when to step back. He understood that every moment of attention given to something is a moment not given to something else. And that trade-off, once seen clearly, became harder to ignore. One night, sitting in that same quiet apartment, Daniel thought about how different things felt compared to a few weeks ago. Not in a dramatic, life-altering way, but in a steady, grounded sense. The chaos had settled, the constant pull had weakened, and in its place was something simple but powerful: control. Not absolute control over everything, but enough control over his own actions to shape the direction of his life. He didn't feel like he was being carried anymore. He felt like he was walking, step by step, choosing where to go, even if the path wasn't always clear. And that feeling, more than anything else, was what made the process worth it. Because at the end of the day, that's what most people are looking for, whether they realize it or not. Not endless pleasure, not constant excitement, but a sense that their life is their own, that their time is being used in a way that reflects what they actually value, not just what is easiest in the moment. And that sense doesn't come from big, one-time decisions. It comes from small, repeated choices, made consistently over time. So if there's anything to take from this, it's not a strict set of rules or a perfect plan to follow. It's a question, a simple one, but one that's worth sitting with. What are you training your mind to expect every single day? Are you teaching it that effort matters, that focus is valuable, that time is something to be used with intention? Or are you teaching it that reward comes instantly, that discomfort should be avoided, that every quiet moment needs to be filled? Because whatever you're teaching it, it's learning. Quietly, consistently, shaping the way you experience your own life. And once you see that, once you really understand it, you start to realize that change isn't about becoming someone else. It's about adjusting what you repeatedly do until your behavior starts to align with the person you already have the potential to be. That process doesn't happen overnight. It doesn't stay perfect, but it moves forward, one decision at a time, as long as you keep paying attention. And if any part of this resonates with you, not in a loud, exciting way, but in that quieter, more honest way that sticks around after you've finished listening, then maybe that's a sign. Not that you need to change everything at once, but that you might want to look a little closer at how you're spending your time, at what you're feeding your attention, at the patterns that are shaping your days without you fully noticing. You don't need to announce it. You don't need to make it dramatic. Just start small. Remove one thing that's pulling you away from what matters. Sit with a little more silence than you're used to. Do one difficult task before reaching for something easy. See what happens. And if you find yourself coming back to these ideas, if you notice that they stay with you longer than the usual noise, then you're already moving in a different direction. Stick around for that. Not because you need more content, but because sometimes it helps to hear these things more than once, from different angles, until they stop feeling like ideas and start feeling like something you actually live by.